All right, Dr. Allen again. This is part 2 of how to read research, basic overview, and talking about this maternal obesity and GBS article. One thing that I failed to mention in the part 1, when you're taking a look at these things, is you also kind of want to look at where they did the study. In this particular instance, it's at this Department of OBGYN at Washington University in St. Louis. That's important to know because it gives you a sense of where it was done. They would generally also talk in the article itself of where in the country it was done as well, because that's important when you're looking at big population factors. You know, just because something is prevalent or apparent in New York City, it may not be have the same impact as something that's going on in the countryside of Wyoming, right? So that tells you where they were. It also, you know, you think about, is this a prestigious institution? Is this, you know, Washington University is actually fairly prestigious in terms of, you know, the broad categories of medical schools and all that, okay? So let's talk about a little more, dive more deeper into this abstract, okay? So when we look at the study design, we say, okay, this was a retrospective cohort study. All right, so that's one of the things you want to look at is, what does that mean, retrospective? Well, there's two general terms. There's retrospective and prospective. Retrospective means looking back in time. Prospective means looking forward in time. So this is a retrospective, or a look back in time, of women, consecutive women, so it means one after the other, with singleton or one baby term pregnancies admitted in labor at this particular hospital. I'm not sure where that is, but maybe they'll explain that a little bit later. And this tells you the date range. Why is that important? Well, we talked in the last part about, well, the article was published in 2015, but it's on data that occurred, you know, 10 years prior. Does that mean anything? Well, you know, we talked before about how recent should the data be. It's kind of hard to really analyze that as far as validity, because, you know, this is now, you know, if something happened in 2004, that was 13 years ago. It's getting to be a little bit old. I don't know. That's just something you keep in the back of mind as you're looking at the article. And this is maternal body mass index, and it's a good idea for you to learn what exactly body mass index means, but essentially it's, you know, their weight over their body surface area. So it's in terms of kilograms per meter squared. And so they determined that if its body mass index is greater than 30, then they're obese, and if it's less than 30, then they're not obese. Okay, and that defined the two comparison groups. And you can say this is a cohort. So a cohort is generally a group. So it's a retrospective look at the two groups or cohorts. The outcome was this group E strep bacteria colonization, and they determined that because of a culture result. Baseline characteristics were compared, and these are some statistical tests. Those are relatively basic tests. The association between obesity and GBS colonization was assessed using this particular type of analysis. Okay, so that's your study design. The results of this many women, so that's a relatively high number, but we don't know if that's a statistically relevant number, you know, but there's 10,000 women were eligible. Of them, 7,000 met inclusion criteria. So that's, you know, 7,000 people in their study, so that seems pretty good. The prevalence of this colonization in the entire cohort was relatively high, so 25%. So that means 1/4 of the women had positive group E strep. Obese gravidas, when they say gravida, they're talking about essentially a pregnant woman, were significantly more likely to be colonized by group E strep when compared to non-obese. And what they do here is they'll have this particular section. They'll say 28% versus 22%. So usually it's 20% was the obese and 22% were non-obese. So overall it was 25%, but when you break it down into categories, 28% were obese, 22% were non-obese. And then they have this thing called P. Now that's your p-value, or measure of statistical significance. And in general, a p-value of less than 0.05 is considered statistically significant, and so in this case it's much less than 0.05, and it's 0.001. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but essentially your p-value is a measure of statistical significance. Then it'll say obese gravidas were still 35% more likely than non-obese women to test positive for GBS after adjusting for race, parity, smoking, and diabetes. So when you see something like that, you think, okay, well, in general, you say obese people were, obese gravidas were more likely to be colonized, but are there any other confounding variables in that, right? So is it because they're obese, or is it because obese in their race, or obese and because they're smokers, or because they have diabetes? So what they say is when they adjust for these particular conditions, they say it's still, you eliminate these extra conditions.
Good evening.
Oh my goodness, Siri just turned on. Here, let me turn that off. So, sorry about that. When you compare for these things, you'll say yes. Even if you control for these things, you would say yes, it's still a factor of obesity despite these other conditions that might be coexisting with it. And then they'll say odds ratio or this, and they'll have a confidence interval. In general, just to kind of say, what does this mean? It's like 1.35 times more likely. And the confidence interval, they put that on there because this is, it's, when they do their statistical analysis, it's between 1.21 and 1.5 times more likely, right? The important thing about the confidence interval is it does not cross 1. So if they said the confidence interval was 0.9 to 1.5, you'd say, well, that's not statistically significant. You'll have to go, you'll learn about that when you do like biostatistics, if you ever get to that point. But since most of you probably won't take that class, don't worry about that for right now. And then they'll go with the conclusion. So we talked about that in part 1. Okay, so we'll call this the end of part 2, and then when we start going to part 3, we'll dig a little bit more deeper into the rest of it. Okay. All right. See you for part 3 coming up next.